Firstly, I'd like to thank the sponsors. I'd like to thank Dairy Australia and the Australian Dairy Conference for sponsoring me to do the travels, and very much like to thank Nuffield as well. I just, as I said, just travelled around Argentina with a friend who's a UK scholar, and he's a dairy farmer as well. And he's been saying to me that we should have a concentrated dairy GFP. Maybe you should just talk to some of the other scholars and find out a little bit before you go down that track too. I'm from Tasmania, which is the South Island of Australia. No New Zealanders here to poke fun at, but that's a great little place. And I've got a dairy farm there. It's a 700 cow farm in a little place called Mersey, where it's fully irrigated and very good grass growth. These are some of the places I've been around the globe, and so countries from through Philippines, China, Canada, USA, Europe, quite a few places in Europe, England, South America. So seen a lot of things, talk to a lot of people. One of the first things that's really been very obvious is the demand for products around the world. We've got, especially in China, we went to the South China University, and we had some of the lecturers talk to us about just the pollution and the amount of food that how they're growing and things like that. Well, I'm not sure whether he's still alive, but this guy told us that the pollution in China, in the Guangdong province, is so bad that there's 100,000 hectares there that the Chinese government's saying is unfit for growing food for human consumption to Chinese standards. So that's pretty bad. It's full of heavy metals. There's a lot of industry there. Heavy metals in the water. So they're growing food there, which is going down the necks of cows and pigs and chickens and things like that. And then, of course, the people are eating that meat anyway, so there's going to be transfer of various baddies going through anyhow. But the world demand for dairy products is growing at 2% per annum, which is about the equivalent of Australia's production per year. So there's quite a lot of there's a big opportunity for dairy, especially in places like Southern Australia and New Zealand, where we can produce milk pretty much as cheap as anybody, cheaper than anywhere else in the world pretty much, and still be able to afford to export it and to be competitive. But India are growing quite high at a high rate as well. They're growing at 3 to 4% per year, but they're mostly keeping up with their own production. Also, the amount of arable land, as I said, in China is reducing, not just from pollution, but from urban sprawl and when I was in India, I heard at Delhi they had a big block of land that had all gone into housing that was perfect agricultural country, and you just wonder what's between their ears sometimes when they go and do things developing on perfect land for growing food in a country like that. And obviously fresh water. Farm ownership's another, probably a little bit contentious, but that's changing towards a corporate model no matter whether we like it or not, and obviously some overseas things as well, overseas money as well. But as I've travelled around, I really found that the well-run family farms really were the most successful and making, generally speaking, the highest profits. And very, a lot of attention to detail, and things were a lot neater and tidier, generally speaking. But the corporates are certainly bringing a lot of much-needed capital to a lot of areas. They like to partner with successful farmers, and they're pretty good at franchising management systems and things like that. So they're bringing a fair few things that are good, but they do need industry support. One of the things, though, that I think is a little side issue that's not too bad is I think often they're not quite as efficient as some of the good farmers, which can probably help a little bit in our talkings with the processors and things to try and get better prices. One very obvious thing too, especially in dairy, is the people. And we really need to have a lot of good people, and this applies to dairies like this one in India. That photo is taken on the side of the road in the centre of the city of Mumbai in India. I actually went to India to have a look at gasification of organic matter, but yeah, couldn't help but stop and go and talk to this guy and find out a little bit. But they're milking yaks there, and they're giving about 5 litres a cow. He's quite a big dairy farmer, and he's got 150, average is 2.5. But they are milked by hand. There's no refrigeration. The milk in those galvanised buckets is tipped into larger containers and taken by push bike to the local shops and things around Mumbai. So no refrigeration, and needless to say, I didn't have too many dairy products while I was in India. In fact, no at all. In fact, I think one of the other groups got quite sick from eating ice cream in India, so we won't go there. But the people, we need some really good methods of training, especially in dairy. Tasmania's just building a new training centre. With wages, obviously we heard last night that the mining industry and coal and the gas industry are paying very high wages, so competitiveness there is a challenge. And we need to provide successful career paths for these people as well. But especially in dairy in Tasmania, farm ownership is still possible, starting with very little equity, which is a good thing. Also saw in Uruguay that some of the farms, the New Zealand dairy farmers in Uruguay set up some very large farms. They've got 50 farms, about 1,000 cows each. Right out in the east, there's a group of farms there that are milking about 8,000, and they're having a lot of staff problems. And the managers, they were telling us that the managers often through the day are just trying to round up enough staff to get the cows milked, and sometimes they don't get the cows milked. So that, you know, the milk production is all over the place and very, very poorly run in certain places. Also, I think that a very successful staff structure is just to have probably half a dozen staff in the one on the one farm, on a dairy farm. Once you go too big with staff on a dairy farm, it does get very difficult. So sort of 6, 7, maybe 8 people is a good number to have, and probably each day 3 or 4 on one farm at a time. Another contentious one, well, maybe not in some places, because we went to Brussels and we got ear-bashed basically by an American guy telling us how good GM or GE is, and that everyone else in the whole world's stupid, and maybe he's right, but that is a question mark. And obviously dairy can gain a lot, especially through breeding of ryegrass that can yield higher energy levels and grow at higher rates, which no doubt somebody's already doing somewhere. So that also chemical use and less disease, those sorts of things, we all know a fair bit about that sort of thing. It's quite interesting what they can do. This is one that I'm not going to give you any good news on, that's for sure. I was very interested in some alternative energy just to have a bit of a look while I was travelling. First place I went to, guys lost €1 million through building one of these things. So he actually had a disaster where there was one of the digesters burst and could have easily killed people. But it's still running today, but even if it didn't burst, he was still running at a loss. The cost of corn's gone up, the cost of the energy sales has gone down. They have to feed the things with a lot of maize silage. The only good news story I had from one of these things was by a guy who hadn't yet fired it up. And he was telling me that it was going to give a 20% return and it was going to be this good, and he had a 7,000 tonne maize bunker, all concrete beside it and dairy on the other side, and all looked fantastic. But I'm looking at this big motor thinking how many times is that going to break down and what sort of gases are going to go through it, and just all the problems I've seen around other places. So for me, I wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. Another thing I looked at was wind turbines, and these, again, only I only touched on these things compared to some of the dairy things, but it was quite interesting. Prince Edward Island, we saw a great heap of turbines, and they wouldn't let us in, so we drove through a paddock of barley and went right up and had a good close look. And they're obviously a huge machine that generate a lot of electricity, but still don't really answer the energy needs of today, even in Holland, where they're running wind turbines all over the place. They're still only producing about 9% of the country's total power needs. So they're good, but they're very expensive as well if you put them in new. And only what we heard was about a 2% return. So that people are reluctant to invest into this sort of thing unless there's government subsidies and that sort of thing to get it going. One that interests me a fair bit was biomass gasification or pyrolysis. This one probably more because of the biochar that you can produce from it, which is good for soil health and locking up carbon and that sort of thing. It does require a cheap fuel source or government subsidies again to be viable, and that, I think if you're probably in a place like Tasmania, you can use municipal waste and lock something in for a long time and actually be paid to take the waste. You could make it work, but the problem would be if there was competition and other people were wanting the same waste that you were using. But they produce best used for a heat source. So in India, a lot of them were using them for kilns and drying grain and that sort of thing. And 1 kilogram of biomass waste generally produced about 1 kilowatt of heat, which was pretty good. But with electricity, it's about only a quarter of that. So producing electricity from these things can take a lot of waste or water or wood chips. This one here in Denmark is using wood chips, but it wouldn't be working if it didn't have some subsidies in place. Biochar does lock up carbon in soils for a long time. They will handle a lot of other waste as well, including sludge, and they can produce biofuels, urea and chemicals. So there's probably an opportunity in these things somewhere down the track. The big one for me was the robotic dairies. They've been around for a long time now. These things have been working for about 15 years around the world. And in Holland and Denmark, over half of the cows are milked through milking robots, and they're producing, Holland alone's got about the same milk production as Australia, so there's no question marks about whether they'll milk cows or not. It's probably more about the price and how we apply them here and things like that, because there are ideas over there of pasture-based farming, and even some of these installations that have gone in Australia and New Zealand are trying to work on a voluntary cow flow process, which our biggest secret to producing cheap milk is in pasture utilisation. And once you start letting cows wander and allowing weather conditions and how much they might have to eat in front of them to determine their movement back and forth to the dairy, it becomes a dangerous area of whether you actually make as good a return off a farm as if you didn't have these things, which is why, and that's a bit of a mouthful of that, is why I think that these things shouldn't be used on a voluntary basis. They are getting a lot cheaper too. These things just back 10 years ago were about $250,000 each, whereas now you're looking at 100,000 and less than that if they can be built as a gang of robots rather than individual robots. That's a bit of a drawing I did up a while back just to have a look at setting up a shed just with a big gang of robots. I've got some blue ones and some red ones just so I don't offend different manufacturers. But I've been looking at doing something like this and probably having a feed pad or something inside the shed as well. But this setup would milk about 270 cows an hour and hopefully reduce staff numbers down to about one staff member for 300 cows, which currently we're running at about one staff member for 125, which is about the state average in Tasmania. That's a very messy picture of a farm layout that I copied off something else. But basically there's three main blocks which you might be able to make out in big rectangles, and they're about 185 hectares each. And that robotic dairy that I showed would have 30 robots in it, and there's an arrow there pointing to where that would go. And each of those 185 hectare blocks would have about a bit over 700 cows on each one, so it's a 2,200 cow setup, and it's set up into 3 blocks, 44 paddocks a block, and cows brought in semi-voluntary, I would say, where there's automatic gates and devices to make cows walk when you want them to, so you're controlling the cows and making them do exactly what they are meant to do. And I heard Richard earlier too mention the virtual farming, which that's a bit of a New Zealand. It started off as a New Zealand idea, I believe. I think Jacqueline Rowarth from Massey Uni has got a book on that sort of thing, where they're talking about controlling the cow traffic and having no fences except for boundary fences, and using sounds and collars on each cow that are GPS, and you've probably heard it, but I think down the track something like this could work like that, but I think we're probably 20 years away from that sort of thing being a reality, and it's not something that I pursue right now, but it's certainly something that's great interest and I think would be happening down the track. This is a De Laval robotic rotary. It's the first one in the world that's commercially going in. It's just been built almost next door to me in Tasmania. I'm not sure why De Laval decided to build it in Tasmania, because it couldn't be much further away from their factory. But I think the main reason is that we run bigger herds than a lot of other places in the world. This is fully robotic. I'm not meant to say much about it because it's under wraps, but if you look on the website, I think you'll find that it's got 4 robotic attachment arms, and it looks about 90 cows an hour. The cost of it, though, at the moment, from what I've been told, is going to be similar to the box system that you saw earlier, the red boxes. And if this thing has one minor breakdown, it's going to stop the whole thing working, which is a bit of a problem, I reckon, that the boxes, at least if one breaks down, you've got 29 others still going. Land prices around the world. This was just an interesting one that I thought was a bit, because I'm looking at the challenges and opportunities for dairy, which I mightn't have mentioned, but that land prices do affect where you can go and what you can do, because you've got to make a return, just like anybody else. So, but I did notice in Prince Edward Island, and in Ireland and Denmark in particular, they've had very large drops in land prices. They've gone from, well, in Ireland, for instance, we were told by another scholar that he'd put a price of, offered $23,000 an acre for a farm next door, a dairy farm, and his neighbour knocked it back, and within 12 months, that was only worth about $10,000. That's still high prices, but that's how things have gone, and obviously the housing, everything in Ireland's a bit like that. And then on Prince Edward Island in Canada, we were talking to potato growers there, and they're doing it pretty tough actually, which was interesting. It seems there's not many places you go where potato growers are making a lot of money, but their land prices have gone from about 5,000 an acre down to 2.5, so they've also seen this happen. Denmark as well, even more than half there, the land prices have dropped quite a bit. So it's a bit of a concern. But then you've got places like USA, England and Holland and India, where they're still going up. Holland in particular, crazy land prices. I think in hectares there they're talking about $70,000, $80,000 a hectare. And India too, some of the most expensive real estate in the world's in Mumbai. Not that it's farms, but just real estate. A little daggy apartment in Mumbai, which looks like you'd pay about 50 grand for it in Australia, is worth $2 million. So very expensive real estate in Mumbai. And Australia, New Zealand, obviously quite steady in land prices, probably some small drops and starting to, well, steady now. And I think everywhere we went, the better farmers are doing about a 10% return on their business, but obviously you go to places like Ukraine and places like that where that's probably more like 100 for other reasons. So in summary, the milk is in high demand around the world. A lot of people have got a taste for the dairy products and are getting a bit more money. Obviously the world population is increasing to about 200,000 people a day as well. Corporates are here to stay, whether we like it or not. I think we need to work with them. More skilled staff are needed right across all of our businesses and industries. Family farms, I think, can continue to be very, very successful. I think down the track, large-scale robotic dairies will be normal. I'd say in 20 to 30 years' time that they will be the standard thing that someone would go and build. Productive land's in high demand, and I think alternative energy is a bit expensive to produce unless there's good government subsidies. So I'd just like to say thank you again, especially to my wife and children who've been missing me a fair bit. I've travelled for 19 weeks. And also to fellow scholars in particular who we've become really good mates with and enjoyed our trip thoroughly, and certainly to Nuffield as well. So thank you.
Well, why do you think it is that it'll be another 20, 30 years before it becomes the norm?
They're very expensive still in reality. But in places like Denmark and Holland, when you actually ask the farmers, you talk about the cost of the setup and what they've spent, and they're saying, well, it wasn't really worth it. And I say, well, would you go back the other way? And they say, no way, we'd sell a farm, we wouldn't be dairy farmers. So I think that's probably going to be the main reason for it to change, and the slowness of the change is that they're expensive. And I think the lifestyle is what drives them more than probably the dollars.
Well, what was the reason for Denmark dropping land prices for Holland and maintaining land prices?
I didn't really get to the bottom of that, Roma, but I would say that population would be a big factor in that. Holland's got 16 million people. I think Denmark's only about 4 million, and Denmark's bigger. So and the land in Holland is better as well. So there's a few different reasons, but yeah, Princess Mary, I didn't get to have lunch with her either, which I was a bit disappointed about. She stays at home in case you don't know.
And technology. Is this sort of technology going to attract different people into dairy? And are you going to need to do that to have the sort of people that will be able to cope with the technology?
Yes, I'm sure that this technology will attract different people into dairy, and that's part of the reason where I'm really pushing it, because we want to have good staff. If we're running one person to 300 cows, we can afford to pay some really good staff. They've got to be technology savvy, and there'll be a lot of other things on the farm that are high tech as well, but really they don't actually have to be the ones to repair or fix. There are some quite good dairy technicians in Tasmania. There's a fairly reasonable sized industry down there, so I think we would be aiming for good technically minded people, but not to make repairs, more to just run the place.
Paul, if you were going to invest in a new dairy farm in Tasmania, would you put robots in?
Yes. Simple answer. Except, I'd clarify that, I think robots for me would be in the herd size range from around 1,600 up to 2,200, so split into 3 herds. If it was a smaller farm, I wouldn't worry about it.
Paul, Michael McKellar, where do you see the future for the dairy industry, given the growing resistance against industrial farming and the corporate model that everybody's got to compete against?
I think again, Tasmania, because we've got a pasture-based system, it's not seen in the same light as the big super dairies of Europe and the confinement systems where cows are housed and sometimes tethered. When people see cows out grazing on pasture, they seem to be quite happy about that. And the cows can be, there's probably more about an effluent thing and how we manage the environment around that rather than anything else. I think, generally speaking, in the southern parts of Australia, we're fairly safe from public perception, except for there's a few practices that the dairy industry probably needs to clean up, but I don't think that's a problem. I think we can do that.
Yes, Paul. Well, Paul, just into travel, looking at this technology and the cost of land, and then we look at various dairy, high and low dairy systems, how do you see, I mean, what sort of system when you run, you're going to put all this money and capital in the technology so it becomes very capital intensive. What sort of a system are you going to run? Are you going to run a low input system, high input system with that?
Yep. I would say that the capital involved in putting robots into that many, per se 2,200 cows, is not that much more than a good rotary dairy or multiple good rotary dairies. So if you buy the robots right, I don't think it's not going to be a huge amount more in the overall cost of setting a farm up. What was the second part of your question, sorry?
Well, would you use, given all that capital intensity there, would you run a higher low input system?
No, I think
with that?
The system of dairy farming around the world, the different systems are very much determined by the weather conditions and what feed sources are available immediately to the farms. So I think for somewhere like Tasmania, where we can grow probably better ryegrass than anywhere else in the world, I wouldn't change it. I'd keep to a reasonably low input system. But we can produce milk down there for probably 20 to 25 cents a litre, whereas you go to somewhere even like Argentina and Uruguay where I've just been, and they can buy grain for $100 a tonne, but their cost of production is still up around 25 to 30 cents a litre. So we're still better off on the low input systems where we are. I'm not saying that would apply everywhere, but that would apply to where I am.
I just wanted to follow up on that. When you're talking about the cost of production, including the cost of capital. It's interesting because in Australia we generally don't put a figure on the cost of capital. We generally just look at the actual feed inputs. So if you're looking at return on investment, we could talk a different angle. But in South America in particular, it's one of the few places I've seen where they look at cost of production and include a land rent. But then when they look at return on investment, often they don't own the land, so that's why they're doing it that way. So for a decent farm in Tassie would be doing a 10% return on investment in dairy.
Including